So, we've had difficulty getting the President's coffin on the airplane. It's finally on the airplane. Mrs. Kennedy's sitting next to it. And Kenneth O'Donnell is trying to get this plane off the ground because he thinks the Dallas police might be showing up at any time to jerk the body off the plane and take it in for an autopsy according to Texas state law. Well, we kind of went to the point where O'Donnell told General Godfrey McHugh to get the plane in the air. Godfrey McHugh went to pilot James Swindle and asked him why the plane had not taken off, and Swindle informed General McHugh that he had not received orders to do so. And I think that's kind of where we left off yesterday, was it not? Well, remember Malcolm Kilduff, the Associate Press Secretary that announced the President's death? He informed the pilot that something was going on to keep Air Force One on the ground. That's why Swindle had not taken off. It's because Associate Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff told Swindle, hey, we can't take off yet. Something's going on. It's going to keep us on the ground. Well, when Swindle told McHugh what Kilduff had said, McHugh went directly to Kilduff and said, why is this plane not taking off? So again, Swindle tells McHugh that Kilduff told him that they couldn't take off because something was going on. So McHugh goes straight to Kilduff and he said, why is this plane not taking off? Well, General McHugh was told by Kilduff that Vice President Johnson was waiting to take the oath of office on the airplane. Now remember, Johnson flew there separately, right? Okay, at the start of the trip. So General McHugh asked Kilduff, why are we not taking off? And Kilduff tells him that the Vice President is waiting to take the oath of office on the airplane. Well, McHugh didn't even realize Vice President Johnson was on the airplane because he thought he would be flying back on the plane that flew him there. And when Kilduff told McHugh that they were waiting for Lyndon Johnson to be sworn in to office before they left, McHugh said, Johnson's not even on the airplane, Malcolm. And Malcolm responds by saying, well, you go tell that 6'4" Texan back there that he's not Lyndon Johnson. So Kilduff had seen Johnson on the plane. That's where he got his info. And McHugh didn't think Johnson was on the plane and didn't think Kilduff knew what he was talking about. Well, General McHugh took offense to that comment. And he said, he pointed right at the coffin of coffin on the airplane. He said, my president is back there on that in that box. So I'll repeat that again. Kilduff says to General McHugh, well, you go tell that 6'4" Texan back there that he's not Lyndon Johnson. And McHugh takes offense and he points to the coffin in the back of the airplane. He states, my president is back there in that box. Now that's just one example that's going to happen, how tough it's going to be for these Kennedy loyalists to transfer their loyalties from John F. Kennedy to Lyndon Johnson. Many of Kennedy's aides and supporters and entourage didn't like Johnson. Kennedy didn't really like Johnson. So this is going to be a tough transition, and General McHugh gives the first example of how tough it's going to be for the Kennedy forces to transfer their loyalties. Now, this is an interesting story because there was little doubt that Lyndon Johnson wanted to be sworn in as President of the United States before Air Force One departed for D.C. No question, he wanted that. But he didn't want to be the one to make the decision. He wanted it to be somebody else's decision, so he didn't take heed on it. So guess who he calls to kind of get his permission to be sworn in as President of the United States aboard Air Force One before it took off? Who's he called? Bobby Kennedy. Very good. He wants Bobby Kennedy's permission or blessing to go ahead and be sworn in. Remember, Bobby Kennedy is the Attorney General of the United States. He's back in Virginia. And Johnson called Kennedy to talk about taking the oath of office in Dallas because he wanted Bobby's permission to take the oath. Now, when he first asked Bobby, because he's the Attorney General, is he asked what were the constitutional requirements as far as taking the oath of office? Who can administer it? What's the legal way for it to be done? So the conversation with Bobby, the Attorney General, isn't right away, hey, should I take the oath of office? It's, how do we do that? Okay, what's the Constitution say about transferring the power of the presidency? Okay, so Vice President Johnson asked Bobby Kennedy what the constitutional requirements were concerning the oath of office and who could administer them. Okay, well, Bobby Kennedy didn't, I don't know if he didn't know or didn't want to say anything, but he told Vice President Johnson he'd check on it and get back to it. Okay, so he doesn't give him an answer. He simply tells him he'll check on it and get back to it. Okay, this is kind of an interesting story. Well, historians will tell you that Vice President Johnson wanted the decision to be Robert Kennedy's idea. And he even stated to the Kennedy personnel on the aircraft, quote, Bobby wants me to take the oath in Dallas. He told people that in the airplane. So after he visited with Bobby Kennedy to find out what the requirements were, he gets back on the plane after Bobby says, or not get back on the plane, gets back into the airplane after Bobby says, I'll get back to you, and he tells everybody, quote, Bobby wants me to take the oath in Dallas. So he kind of makes up a little bit of a story according to Bobby Kennedy, who later insisted it was Johnson's idea to be sworn in Dallas, not his. So you got a controversy right here, okay? So Johnson talks to Bobby Kennedy. He asks about the constitutional requirements. He says he'll get back to him. Johnson gets off the phone. He goes back to the airplane. He tells the Kennedy camp, Bobby wants me to take the oath in Dallas. And later, Bobby Kennedy insists it was Johnson's idea to take the oath in Dallas, not his. Now, of course, and everybody back in Washington finds this out later. They are not very happy about the whole thing, because here's what happens. Well, now look at this. After receiving Bobby's blessing, according to Lyndon Johnson, he called a fellow by the name of Irving Goldberg, he being President Johnson. Okay, Irving Goldberg was called. Now, who was Irving Goldberg? He was a personal friend and a political advisor to Vice President Johnson. So after receiving Bobby's, quote, blessing, Vice President Johnson calls Irving Goldberg, who is a personal friend and political advisor to the Vice President. And what does he ask him? We already asked Bobby this. Not so much the constitutional rights, but what he asked Goldberg is, hey, who can officially swear me in as president? Who can officially swear me in? Well, Goldberg didn't know. So what did he do? What did Goldberg do? Huh? No, he didn't call Bobby, but he called a U.S. attorney by the name of Barefoot Sanders to get the information. So Bobby calls Irving Goldberg to find out who can swear him in as President of the United States. Irving Goldberg does not know, and so he calls an attorney, a U.S. attorney friend of his, Barefoot Sanders, to get that information. And here's Barefoot Sanders, kind of ironically, right here with President Kennedy. So he calls U.S. Attorney Barefoot Sanders to find out who can swear him in. Well, Sanders looks into it, and he calls Irving Goldberg back, and he tells him that a federal judge can legally administer the oath of office. So Barefoot Sanders finds out that a federal judge can legally administer the oath of office. He calls Irving Goldberg back and gives him that information. Well, what does Goldberg do? He goes and tells, come on, Lyndon Johnson that a federal judge can swear him in. So what does he tell Goldberg to do? Go find a federal judge to do so. So when Irving Goldberg relays the information back to Johnson that a federal judge could administer the oath of office, the Vice President tells Goldberg to go find him one. Well, Goldberg knew a federal judge, and her name was Sarah T. Hughes. Sarah T. Hughes. And was a friend of his, and he called her at her home and asked her to come out to Love Field to swear in Lyndon Johnson as President of the United States. Can you imagine getting that phone call? When you think about that, that would be interesting. So Sarah T. Hughes, a federal judge, is called at her home. Goldberg asked her to come out to Love Field. Well, after Johnson knew that Sarah T. Hughes was coming out and knew that when she got there he would be sworn in as president, the vice president and Mrs. Johnson then went to Mrs. Kennedy's cabin in the airplane where the president's coffin was and visited with her. So after Johnson knew arrangements were being made, the federal judge, Sarah T. Hughes, was on her way and he was going to be sworn in as president. He and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, go to Mrs. Kennedy's cabin to express their sorrow to her. Really the first time the vice president's really visited with Jackie since the president was assassinated. Everything's been a little crazy. Well, Mrs. Johnson, Lady Bird Johnson was a very nice lady. And she suggested kindly to Mrs. Kennedy that she might want to clean up because they would like her to be part of the swearing in ceremony. They'd like her there, which she really should have been. And Mrs. Johnson kind of politely suggests that she might want to clean up a little bit because you know what she looks like, right? We've talked about that. And Jackie refused, stating, "I want them to see what they have done to Jack." And of course, Jack was the president's nickname that only close family and friends referred to him as. So when Mrs. Johnson suggested to Mrs. Kennedy she might want to clean up prior to the swearing in of Vice President Johnson because they wanted her there, she refused, stating, "I want them to see what they've done to Jack." Well, soon afterwards, Judge Hughes arrives aboard Air Force One, and at 2:38 p.m. on that same long day that we've been talking about, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. So soon afterwards, Judge Sarah T. Hughes arrives aboard Air Force One, and at 2:38 p.m., Lyndon Johnson is sworn in as the nation's 36th President. I want you to dig through your notes, and I want you to grab that famous photograph of Johnson being administered the oath of office. That was taken by Cecil Stoughton, a name you need to know, who was the White House photographer. On the front is the picture, on the back is the picture with numbers, and we're going to tell you who was in the picture. That's what you're going to need to know, so you can do it any way you want. So, again, the famous photograph of Johnson being administered the oath of office was taken by Cecil Stoughton, who was a White House photographer. And I'll tell you just a little bit about him before we get to the picture. Cecil Stoughton was kind of picked by Mrs. Kennedy and the President to photograph events at the White House when he was elected. And he became in history really the first official White House photographer. Okay? He became the first official White House photographer. And it was a position that now has become standard for presidents. But at the time, they didn't have an official White House photographer. Cecil Stoughton was. And he happened to take this famous picture. And we'll talk a little bit more about him in just a little bit. But let's go to the picture. And you need to go to the side that has the numbers. And these, I'm sorry this is a little better, but you'll get the gist. Because some of the people, you can only see partial parts of them, but at least you'll know who's there. Some on your ID sheet, some not. Number one in your picture is Malcolm Kilduff. Malcolm Kilduff is number one. And he made the only audio recording of the event, and he held up, remember that dictaphone that President Kennedy talked into when he had Mrs. Lincoln write the letter to Rudolph Anderson's parents, that thing he talked into? They had a portable one on the airplane. And that is the only audio recording of this event, is because Malcolm Kilduff had the wherewithal to grab one of those dictaphones that had been on the President's desk on Air Force One and record this historic event. Who's number two? Right, Sarah T. Hughes, the judge. She's the one that swore in Vice President Johnson. Okay, number three is on your ID sheet, a fellow by the name of Jack Valente. Jack Valente. Now, during the time of this picture, he was a liaison between the president and the news media concerning his trip to Dallas. So they hired Jack Valenti to be the guy to work with the media during Kennedy's trip to Texas. And he just happened to be on the airplane and later becomes a very special assistant to President Johnson during the time Johnson serves the rest of Kennedy's term and his own term later. So Jack Valenti was simply a guy they hired to kind of do the relations between the media and President Kennedy's trip to Dallas. He later will become a very special assistant and close friend of Lyndon Johnson during the time he serves as president. Anybody want to guess how number 4 is? We've talked about him, and I'll give you a hint. Houston. Who is number 4? Houston. What? No. Houston, specifically Houston. What did Kennedy do in Houston besides meet with LULAC? Senator Albert Thomas, that he spoke in his behalf in Houston. That's Albert Thomas. He was the congressman whom President Kennedy spoke at that appreciation dinner the day before on November 21st, 1963. Albert Thomas. Number 5, I don't know how well you can see number 5. I kind of, not very good. But number 5 was Marie Femmer. And she was a personal secretary to Vice President Johnson. Marie Femmer was in the picture, personal secretary to Vice President Johnson. You might get on the internet and look this picture up if you're really curious on maybe kind of what these people look like. Who is 6? Lady Bird Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, yes. And 7? 7 is Lyndon Johnson. And 8 is Jackie Kennedy. Pretty easy to figure out, those 3. So 6 is Lady Bird Johnson, 7 is Lyndon Baines Johnson, and 8 is Jackie Kennedy. Number 9 is hard to see. Number 9 is pretty hard to see. But it's Homer, this guy right here, Homer Thornberry. Homer Thornberry is number 9. He was a congressman from Texas, and he had recently been appointed by President Kennedy to a seat on the U.S. District Court. So Homer Thornberry was a congressman from Texas, and just prior to the assassination, he had been appointed by President Kennedy to a seat on the U.S. District Court. Number 10, you can't see much but her glasses. Number 10 is Evelyn Lincoln. Who's Evelyn Lincoln? Come on now.
She was at White House.
She was his personal secretary. Yep, personal secretary. Remember that he agreed to meet with some of her friends when they were in Fort Worth? So, Evelyn Lincoln. There's Evelyn Lincoln right up there. Several pictures of her as the president. Number 11. Anybody want to guess who that is? Can you see much of him in there? Can't see ahead. Well, I'll just tell you. Roy Kellerman. Who was he? Come on.
He's the
Head of the Secret Service. Roy Kellerman is in the photo. Head of the Secret Service. Number 12. Can't see very good in this picture. Guy by the name of Lem Johns. Lem Johns. And he was a Secret Service agent that was assigned during the Dallas trip to Vice President Johnson. Lem Johns, Secret Service agent assigned to Vice President Johnson. Can you see 13 very good? No. 13 is Pamela Tunyer. Pamela Tunyer. And she was a personal assistant to Jackie Kennedy. Pamela Tunyer. Personal assistant to Jackie Kennedy. $14. Guy by name of, you can see him a little better, can't you? Kind of. Jack Brooks. It's B-R-O-O-K-S. Do I have it wrong on there?
B-R-R-O.
Oh yeah, it's B-R-O-O-K-S, sorry. Jack Brooks. He was a congressman from Texas who eventually served 42 years in the House of Representatives. That's a long time. You know how much your terms are in the House? How many your terms? 2. Think about how many terms he was elected to. He served 42 years in the House of Representatives, and he was actually in the motorcade during the assassination behind Vice President Johnson's car. Okay? Number 15 is a guy by the name of Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers. He was a journalist, simply there to cover the White House. He eventually became press secretary from 65 to 67 under Lyndon Johnson. But at the time, he was not the press secretary, obviously, simply a journalist. And interesting enough, he had been assigned by President Kennedy as Director of Public Affairs for the Peace Corps. Remember we talked about the Peace Corps? He was the first Public Affairs Director of the Peace Corps. So he had some ties with both Kennedy and Johnson. 16, this is what I want to make sure you get. You can only see part of his eye. Familiar name though, driving the lead car in the motorcade, Jesse Curry, Police Chief of Dallas. Jesse Curry. That is your famous picture. He's number 16, because you can just see his eye there. Okay. After this is taken care of at 2:46 p.m., Air Force One takes off for Washington, D.C. 2:46 p.m., Air Force One takes off for Washington, D.C. And what do you think President Johnson does at 3 o'clock? Who does he call at 3 o'clock? Now really think about this. Who would he call maybe to express his sorrow at 3 o'clock? He called Bobby already.
Robert.
What?
Where is Bobby?
Bobby's in Virginia. He's back in Virginia. So who